All right, it's good to be back. How you doing, Paul?
Hey, man.
Good to see you. So you had an eventful weekend while I was gone. Venerable Simkila was here for the weekend, and just thought I'd pause for a minute to see if anyone had any questions or anything that may have popped up.
When's she coming back?
When's she coming back? That's a good question. So those are the requests we want to make right away, and see when we can make that happen. I learned from my teacher to make requests as soon as possible, so I think when we picked her up, we requested she returned. So she's was a little ill, and we got word that she's getting better and healing up back at the monastery, so at the abbey. And when she's a little bit better, we'll see if we can't pin down some more time. Huh? Yeah.
I got a question.
Okay.
And I asked it to Venerable Semke as well, but maybe get another viewpoint. A lot of the discussion went down the road of attachment leading to anger, and then my mind went back to the center of the wheel of life with ignorance, and I've been working with the other two words, attachment and anger. I thought were some words that were used there, and so I might be mixed up about those words, but I was kind of looking at the difference in between attachment being this idea if it doesn't get what it wants, then that leads to anger, and that attachment, if it gets what it wants, leads to craving and those sorts of things. So to kind of talk on in that way.
Okay. So hopefully those of you online, I'll try to recap the question. The talk at the end of the weekend, they talked a bit about the relationship between attachment and anger. And Aaron was mentioning, his mind went to the center of the wheel of life. And that's the driver, the real driving force. What creates samsara? What creates this wheel of life, this experience that we have? And there's three aspects in there, the three root poisons. And the first one, number one, is misperception. Right? Misperception of self, a grasping of self, of John in a particular way, and the world in a particular misunderstanding, a misperception. Often it's just labeled ignorance. I don't know. Everything looks pretty real to me. I feel pretty real. Seems like it is. And out of that misperception, I like to use the two other words as attachment and aversion. So out of, as I'm crawling around a little baby and I start to see things and, this looks pretty cool, I like that. And somebody takes it away and now I'm upset, because they took my little thing away. And, certain foods I like and ones I don't like. And to get what I like and what feels good, I do certain things. And, to avoid the things I don't like, or when somebody takes my stuff, I have a tantrum. And so you can see how these sort of dynamics, just early on, I want to get what I like and I want to avoid what I don't like, and I'm going to scream and cry. I'm going to do different things. Sometimes crying is a request, right? Babies cry because they need some love or something. And that sets this force, of karmic actions, things that I do to get what I want or to avoid things. And so that karmas, these wholesome and unwholesome karmas take place, the activities I do to engage in that. So getting back to your question then, you noted that there were sometimes the three have different words. I use misperception, attachment, aversion a lot, or ignorance, attachment, aversion. But sometimes it is like greed and hatred, I believe. So maybe when you're thinking there's that hatred. So attachment, so it would be the greed. The aversion would be hatred. So sometimes it's put in there like that, presented that way. And so I think if I'm getting at your question is that instead of aversion, sometimes you use hatred. So that might be confusing with the idea of attachment. So coming back to the core thing, without misperception, you wouldn't have any of these mental afflictions. That's the fundamental one. Fundamental one. And that's the whole point of Buddhism. The whole point. The highest realization, non-self. This understanding. Wisdom. And then you can see then where attachment easily leads to anger. The common theme with anger is something is thwarting me from what I want or what I think should happen. That's why we get angry. So I'm very attached to something being a certain way. Something's blocking that. So attachment gives rise, but that attachment is always based upon a misperception of self and of how much joy or happiness or how things ought to be. How that's going to turn out one way or the other. But in the subtle piece, you can see how attachment is related to both aversion and this attachment. I'm pretty attached.
Reaction.
What's that?
Chain reaction.
Yeah, you can say one to the other. But instead of just calling it attachment and aversion, we can be very attached to aversion. I'm really attached to that not happening. I'm really attached to not having to deal with this person. I'm really attached to something not happening. So I work really hard to make these things not happen. So there's an attachment there. So often it's this grasping. So this grasping that creates then that chain reaction, as you're talking about, of mental afflictions. So in essence, would it be possible for anger to arise without some degree of attachment? And even if you say, well, maybe I don't have that much attachment to an outcome or a thing, you know what you do have an attachment to? Self. The greatest attachment of all, self-cherishing, self, me, and mine. That is the root. And so this whole text, if we go back to all these points, blame all things on the one thing. The one thing was self-cherishing. But self-cherishing in not in the healthy self-esteem way. Self-cherishing in preserving this perception of self in relation to others. And a self-cherishing that really sees itself quite a bit as the center of the universe. It's kind of fascinating how we do that.
Egotistical?
I wouldn't even go that far. Just our normal sense of self is self-cherishing. It doesn't have to be a narcissist. You can have a very kind, compassionate person, but they're still cherishing a sense of self, their garden, their house, the things that they love, their family, and they're separating them in mine and yours. And a self-cherishing in my political view. A self-cherishing in how I think the world ought to be, how I think you ought to act. At the root of it's still a self-cherishing, so it could be even done on that very subtle level. But it's always there, this sense of self. And we do things to preserve that sense of self. And we get threatened when it sometimes gets taken. One of the most fascinating ways that we do this is how we hang on to wounds, old emotional wounds. It's like merit badges on my ego and self. Somebody tries to tell you, maybe you should let that go. No way, you don't know how bad it was. Let me tell you how tough it was. To just preserve this pain that I earned. What's that?
Chip on the shoulder?
Yeah, chip on the shoulder. I think, we can bring up a resentment from 10 years ago, and it's right there. And somebody goes, well, maybe you should forgive them. I'm not ever going to forgive them, because the pain is too too important to me. We had a talk the other night on forgiveness. And, the question came up, what do you do with a justifiable resentment? Justifiable resentments. A lot of times people talk about justifiable anger. And so from a Buddhist point of view, as you look at, I would argue from a psychological point of view, but justifiable resentment, the implication is that somebody did something to me that was clearly wrong, clearly, in a way that violates, how someone should treat somebody. And they did this, and they did me wrong in some way, and therein lies, they did this, my anger, my resentment is justified because of what they did. So we look at that and we go, well, when I'm angry and resentful, who is suffering? Yeah, I'm suffering. Are they suffering because I'm resentful? Generally not. Some people, we could hurt their feelings back and they could carry that too, but me hanging on to a resentment, especially as time goes on, pretty much they go back to their life, I go back to my life, and I hang on this resentment. So they did something to me, so I'm angry, so I hurt, so I carry resentment. When I have resentment or when I have anger, I am clearly not very happy, and I'm not very balanced, and I'm suffering. So herein lies the question, is there such thing as justifiable anger or resentment? And I would say no, because there's nothing that you could do to me that would justify me hurting myself. There's nothing you could do to me that would justify me hurting myself. If you go a little deeper with the Buddhist point of view, there's no self that's really getting injured, right? Who's angry, And who is angry? A sense of a self-cherishing. But anger is going to come and go. Our stream of consciousness, how I'm arising in this moment, is dependent upon causes and conditions. So how I'm even perceiving John in this moment is just a momentary version of John, which will change in another moment. It'll change when I walk out the door. And new labels will come, and new thoughts will come, and new emotions will come. And they'll all be very short-lived. But they're always arising moment-to-moment in dependence upon what's happening. And there's no stable John in all of that. This moment is dependent upon previous moment. Future moments will give rise from these moments. So in essence, what I'm doing now is going to lead to those next moments. So if I would prefer those next moments be filled with some inner peace, well-being, watering the seeds of anger is probably not going to get me there. Probably not. So, the main practice here on point 2 is really cultivating those 2 bodhicittas, which is recognizing and understanding that moment-to-moment dependent arising that gives rise to how we perceive ourselves. And then maintaining that view is a practice in and of itself, and we're going to get to that in a bit. But if we spend time on that and we start to notice how fleeting those things are, we don't have to be attached to them in a sense of self, because that becomes, again, the core root. The real way to eliminate all mental afflictions is to really realize that. But needless to say, it's a bit of a challenge. Did that help you with your question?
Thank you.
So we've worked our way up to the 7th point, and so the 7th point of mind training is these practices. How do I really, all of these are practices. All of these are, essentially meditations where you gain some realization and you work your way through this process of gaining some realization and then engaging in life with it. Not just talking about it, not just thinking about it, but let's try it out. Let's test it out. Let's see how this works. And in that way, we can really get some footing. And the practices here at the end are recommended that you take a little time and really reflect and meditate on 1 or 2 a day and just kind of work your way through them slowly, not try to do 20 of them, piecemeal. Just, take a little time. So we did the first 3, I think, last time. We did practice all yogas by the means of 1. Counteract all withdrawal by means of 1. 2 actions on 2 occasions, beginning and end. I think that's where we wrapped up, which would put us... I wonder if I did this. It was only a week ago. I ought to be mindful of this. Whichever of the opposites occur, be patient. We talked about equanimity and inner stability. Well, let me see it. This is really related to equanimity. Just pausing to remember if I talked about this last time. There's been a few teachings in this last week. So we'll just begin. Because I don't recall I did. So whichever of the opposites occurs, be patient. The polarities of good fortune, misfortune, we're pretty much driven that way, right? I really, want to, people say, how's your day going? It's a good day. How was your trip? I was asked that a lot of times. It was a great trip. Yeah, it was a good trip. Other people, it was a terrible trip. Oh, it was awful. It was the worst ever. What happened? And so our mind constantly going to vacillating between really, terrible things happening, really wonderful things happening. We keep striving for one, trying to avoid another. And what this is saying is really to make it a point to rest in equanimity. So one of the first sayings I got a long time, years ago, was when it's all terrible, when it's really desperate, remember, this too shall pass. It'll get better, right? All of us have had traumas in our lifetimes, and we got better, and it doesn't last. And then they say, and when it's all good, enjoy it, because it'll get worse. And that's a hook, because we forget that. When it gets really good, you know what we do? We want to preserve it. Oh, man, I'm going to make this happen, my relationship, my, house, the job, whatever it is, I'm going to preserve. How do I keep it? And that creates a lot of suffering right there. So it is making a point that even when it's really good, that's not the time to grab on. It's time to use it wisely. Stay in that equanimous state of mind, recognizing that these things are fleeting, and they're outer things that are fleeting, and that throughout our lifetimes, especially in terms of outer events, things are going to happen that are beneficial, unbeneficial, hard, tragic, difficult, joyful, amazing. And all of us can recognize that we've had more of those types of moments than we can ever remember. We've had more blissful times than we can count. We can't remember, we can't even reflect. How many times you were sitting there and had the most delicious dessert and a nice sunset or whatever was going on. I can't even remember how many wonderful things have happened. Or I got that hug when I needed one, or just these moments of our life. There have been so many. And yet we're still subject to anger, resentment, and jealousy and all that. And likewise, we've had terrible things happen, and we've still found joy. So it's really understanding that the nature of things is that. And so, all of which, going to a previous point, all yoga is into one, that we use all things for one. To cultivate wisdom and merit, to cultivate bodhicitta, that whether it's a difficult thing, well, that becomes an opportunity to grow. And when it's a good thing, well, let's use those resources for spiritual growth. One's not necessarily better than the other. As a matter of fact, it's usually much more difficult to really get direct spiritual merit and wisdom from really joyful events. We're usually too busy enjoying them. But when things are really desperate, suddenly we're willing to dig in and take a look at the source of the problem. That's what Tenzin Palm, I love quoting her on that. She says, everybody asks me, how to get rid of my anger, how to work with my anger. She says, nobody asks me how to get rid of my greed. I don't want to give up my cool stuff. I just don't want to be so angry. But I really want all this cool stuff. And as we talked about, it's the attachment to the stuff that creates the anger. So it's really resting in there. So we want to abandon going, both those directions. Yeah, I don't think I brought that last time. The next one is one that we did cover, a version of it in the pledges, but it's called Guard the Two at the Cost of Your Life. So the two are pledges that we've made. So we've made pledges. There's formal pledges in a Dharma practice. So oftentimes, people become, especially true in the Tibetan tradition, if we take formal refuge vows, you will formally sit there and take vows. And there's these 5 that are very fundamental that people will often take, and they take refuge. They formally become a Buddhist. Sometimes people go to teachings or they get empowerments and they take vows or precepts. But we also have some vows that we consciously take in our lives that, I've learned this lesson. I'm not going to do that anymore. Right? Virtuous activities, non-virtuous activities. New Year's is coming up soon. A lot of people take vows at New Year's. Yeah. And the deal here is to not abandon those. So, recall what they are, know what they are. Because they fade away, right? They fade away. It was so clear when I made them. It was so clear. This is just harming me. I don't want to live like that. And now it's Tuesday, and I don't even think about that anymore. It's gone. It's gone. So one point here is be very clear about the precepts you take, the vows you take. Be very clear what they are. A lot of people take some, for teaching or different things, and they don't even know what they are. So be real clear what they are and how that's going to benefit you. And then also revisit, if it's not a Dharma vow, if it's a vow that, sometimes we get caught up in a way of living that worked for a bit. But as we learn more, gain some realization, realize it's not that healthy. And so you want to be clear about that too. But here, this is very specific to Dharma vows. And then the second one is the vows and precepts contained in this teaching. So the 7-point mind training. So if you're going to engage in 7-point mind training, you want to guard them. And here's the catch. You want to get these words very specific. At the cost of your life. And he makes a point here. He says that even at the cost of your life, this is a demanding statement and very earnestly meant. This is not for the lighthearted. This is, I am here on a bodhisattva path for the benefit of all sentient beings. There are some things that are more precious than one's life. Several lamas have commented to me that there is no value in a long life that is dominated by unwholesome actions of body, speech, and mind. Obviously, in such a life, one is simply polluting one's stream of consciousness, sowing seeds year after year for repercussions of further suffering and misery. What is it that brings value and benefit to the very core of life? It's our Dharma practice. Rather than sacrifice our spiritual practice, it is better to sacrifice a life. So it's pretty clearly stated. And they're not saying, give up your life. They're saying that choose this practice over the worldly concern of that life. Choose this practice. Because a long life of contaminating my consciousness is more damaging than having to die in a way that continues a spiritual path. And so there's not a lot of leeway there. Sometimes we like to fluff it up a bit and make it nice, but no, he's just saying yeah, you want to keep doing this thing and keep polluting your mind, that's not so healthy. But maintaining wholesome, virtuous, compassionate activity in alignment with your practice, it's going to be more powerful. And this next one is called Practice the Three Austerities. And this is three austerities. These are difficult things to do. First one is to be able to maintain awareness, continuous awareness of the antidotes to mental afflictions. So that we have to first know that I have them. They arise. And, in our teachings, we start to know what these antidotes are, so that when I get a little irritable, or I get a little fearful, or I get resentment, that as they're arising, I have the antidotes. I'm bearing that in mind. When we think about mindfulness, this is really this view on mindfulness. I am bearing in mind the solutions and not getting caught up in the problems. So I'm bearing in mind, the solution. So we talk often in the other teachings on mindfulness that we do around three misperceptions. So there's three marks of existence. If we can bear those three marks of existence in mind, that would be a shortcut to a lot of antidotes. And those are that things are impermanent. How about if we remembered that? How about outer things are never going to provide you any lasting happiness? Unsatisfactoriness of samsara. What if I remembered that? What if I remembered non-self? That John that I'm so attached to? Can't find him when I look. I cannot find him. I cannot find him. Is he the legs, the foot, the eyes? What is he? Is he the things he did before? Is he... What is he? When you start tearing that apart. And so, if we could bear in mind just that's a shortcut, a little template. Three marks of existence. If I could bear in mind reality, three marks of existence of our experience: non-self, unsatisfactoriness, and impermanence. Those are pretty good antidotes. It's really hard to have a lot of mental afflictions arise when I realize that things come and go and they're impermanent, that my thoughts and feelings come and go and that they're impermanent. If I remember that how things happen out there are not the source of my suffering, that's a pretty good antidote. And that antidote is going to be really helpful if I notice that a lot. It doesn't help very much if I talk about it once in a while and then go out and then look for all my happiness in all the wrong places. It's not super effective. So this is saying that first austerity is bearing that in mind. Really bearing that in mind. Having those antidotes. And the fun Yeah, okay, that's the third. So in this first austerity, it's really developing mindfulness. It's developing mindfulness. It's interesting when we think about what do we really want in life. On a Buddhist path, to be totally liberated, to be a benefit to all beings, to be awake, to be free of suffering. And for those of us still just checking this thing out, a lot of people are just seeking some relief. In general, most humans do not want to feel resentful, angry, frustration. We just don't, in general, right? And yet we will nourish those mental states, and we will validate those mental states, and we will cling to those mental states out of habit. Out of habit. But if I really understood that the source of this inner peace and well-being and joy really comes from seeing things more accurately and not being attached to ideas and concepts that are not based in reality. Deceptive appearances. That's what we covered at the start. Things appear to us very deceptively. The apple pie really looks like the source of deliciousness. And our dear friend Seth will debate you all day that it is clearly a source of genuine happiness. So it's deceptively appearing. It tastes good. It feels good. It's pleasurable. It's the source of my pleasure. Very deceptive. Until we look a little more deeply. The craving for the apple pie. The apple pie when I'm sick, it doesn't taste so good. Probably some of the not so good health benefits if you eat a lot of apple pie. The upset stomach when I eat too much apple pie. When you start looking at apple pie a bit, it can be a lot of things. But it will not be inherently the source of your happiness. But it appears that way when we have a little bit. So whether it's apple pie, whether it's a human being, whether it's a job, whether it's, whatever, it can't provide that. So one of the ways that you can really develop mindfulness and start with this first austerity is to take a little time in the morning to bring to mind reality. Things change. Your relationships, everybody you know in your life, the weather, traffic, everything all the time changing. We're trying to constantly make things permanent that are not permanent. And we're trying to really somehow find a lot of stability in something that is fundamentally unstable. Source of a lot of suffering. So if I brought to mind that impermanence, if I brought to mind this unsatisfactoriness, the meaning that the very things I think will bring me pleasure and joy are the source of my stress, worry, and fear. Because the things that are most important to us are the things that we worry about, that we stress about, with some idealized version that somehow if I can preserve it in a particular way, I will be happy. And then carrying a sense of identity, of John, this sense of self, and not realizing that I'm changing all the time. And fortunately, yeah, it's a good thing, because if you go back a few years, you probably wouldn't want me hanging out with you much. I've been changing. I've been working on improving myself. And so we can change and we can improve. And that my thoughts and feelings, this John, when I stick labels on myself, I'm responsible, I'm irresponsible, I'm funny, I'm not funny, I'm good with people, I'm not good with people, I'm a patient person, I'm an impatient person. These are all labels. I can just stick a bunch of labels all over my body. There's an exercise where you actually do that. You put all these qualities, you start taking them off, because if you say you're a patient person, have you ever been impatient? Label's gone. If you think you're an impatient person, have you ever been patient? Label gone. I'm a responsible person. Have you ever been irresponsible? Label gone. You can identify yourself all day long. Stick a label on. It's not going to capture who you are, is it? But we really hang on to them. Really hang on to them. Someone would ask you to describe yourself. We would bring these qualities to mind about who we are. And then the question is, are you like that all the time? Or would you like to be like that all the time? Or are you even like that some of the time? And we carry that. And we defend it. And because of that, we get offended. That was a retreat question somebody asked me once, about getting offended. Who is it that's offended? Which John? Which John would be offended? The one that was here 10 minutes ago, or this John? Who is there to be offended? A mentally afflicted state is offended. So we took a little time and remembered, or brought to mind, 3 marks of existence: that you're changing moment to moment, that things are impermanent, and that outer events and circumstances do not create your lasting happiness or your lasting suffering. Well, those would be some pretty good antidotes to bring into your day. Though there's a lot more you can remember. So, Venerable Simki was speaking on fortitude, which is their version of patience, fortitude. And so that's often taught as the antidote to anger. Most people, what do people tell you to do when you're angry? Take a breath. Take a walk. Step outside, right? Well, they're patience, right? Because anger will come and go. Fortitude, resting, this will come and it will go. So there's a whole list of antidotes within Buddhist teachings. So we don't have time to go through all that. But in here, he recommended people visit the chapter 6 of the Guide to Bodhisattva's Way of Life. A lot of good antidotes, things that we can apply to these things. So the second austerity, so one is having these in mind, bearing them in mind, bringing them to mind, moment to moment, not getting caught up in all this. Being able to rest in this knowing. The second one is when mentally afflicted states arise. And the definition of mentally afflicted state is anything that's pulling me out of this inner peace and well-being that's present. So it can go either way, actually. Sometimes a lot of joy can really pull us out of a pretty balanced state. Sometimes a lot of anger. Sometimes little things. But to notice when it's arising is that first us. And as we bear it in mind, then the idea is to point at it. The second one is to turn away from it. To know you are not my friend. There is no justifiable anger here. I am not going to spend the next 20 minutes rationalizing why I'm angry. I'm not going to go down that road. That's not my friend. I can recognize that anger is arising and there's a reason for it. But it will come and go, and I am not hitching the ride. Because that's the easy thing to do, right? The easy thing to do is when thoughts or mental afflictions or emotions come, the easy thing is I just get in the car and I am going for a ride. And if I got friends around, I'm inviting them in the car too. And you're coming along too. And we're going to really go along and talk about how much this sucks. The second austerity is to point a finger at and go, I'm not going there. You're not my friend. I have identified you. That's self-cherishing. This is not beneficial to me or anyone. There's nothing that you can do that would justify me harming my own mental state. There's just not justifiable. And the third one is to apply the antidote. So you have the antidotes, you notice it arising. Third one, apply the antidotes. Cut to the root. And here specifically they're talking about the main antidote. The main antidote is the understanding of emptiness. That this is all just conjecture. I mean, really understanding that this is really my mind that's upset and suffering over how I'm viewing something. So that realization, these ultimate bodhicitta, relative bodhicitta, those are pretty, it requires some advanced practice. So that's where he recommended, maybe we learn some of the other antidotes first. Of being patient when anger comes, noting these things. However, I think the middle path there is really understanding the 3 marks of existence. In order to understand the 3 marks of existence, you need to pay attention to them during the day. Do things change? Notice them change. Notice them change. Keep an emotional journal all day. Imagine what it would be like if you wrote down every emotion you had in a day. What would that be like? You'd have a pretty thick journal, maybe. And that's just one day. Surprise, shock, nervousness. You just start jotting those down. And, we're aware of just so few, really, that we have in a day because we're not paying that much attention. And we're not noting them. But the big ones stick. Right? That's my friend, I love to quote him. He said I can officially take it now, I think. Because once you cite somebody 3 or 4 times, it's yours. And he doesn't even know who he took it from. It was somebody. But the guy says, I never had a bad day in my life. I've had a bad 5 minutes. I've made it last all day. Isn't that what we do with an emotion? We take one and we ride that. And so, if we were to really look at how many emotions come in a day, you're going to see a sense of non-self and a sense of impermanence. I'm angry, I'm upset, I'm surprised, I'm shocked a little bit, I'm a little nervous, I'm a little bit anxious. I. As opposed to experiencing a little bit of anxiety, experiencing a little bit of excitement, experiencing some joy, all of which will come and go. All of which will come and go. And if we were to write those down or observe them, impermanence, everything's impermanent. What about your job has stayed the same? How is each day different at your job? A lot of people say, same old routine every day. Really? Start paying attention to your same old routine every day. You might start noticing things are different. My relationships. You haven't changed a bit in years. People say that a lot. Yeah. Bet you have. Start noticing that. Start noticing, how much or how lasting the joy is of anything that you treasure. And notice how fleeting, the things are that you don't like. How long does that last? How long could you possibly be mad at something? Sometimes it seems like a long time, but even in that time, it doesn't last that long. Until we think about something else. So if we were to mindfully observe these things, we would get some realization of them. Then as we engage our day, we would have that first austerity, I think, would be a really good antidote. The antidote ultimately is to live in reality of 3 marks of existence. That's pretty good. Then there's lots of other ones that we can include. Does that make sense? Okay. 3 austerities. So they're tough things to practice. I wanted to get to this next one. May not, because I want to do it some justice. The 3 principal causes. So acquire the 3 principal causes. I'm going to embark upon it anyway. I may have to finish. The 3 principal causes are the causes that lead to spiritual growth and awakening. The first one is developing a relationship with a spiritual mentor who is well trained in practical guidance through a lineage of teachers, and is also endowed with some insight. And so he adds here to the commentary that it is very important for Dharma practitioners, not the least of those who are teachers, to be endowed with sound learning. With sound learning. So he's making a point here that maybe we don't need to be the most erudite scholars, because some people know a lot of stuff. They're really good scholars. But they should have, a clear understanding of the practices that we engage in. And for acquiring that knowledge, there's really no substitute for a teacher. And the point he's making, books alone can never be a substitute. To come to life, they must be moistened with the oral teachings of a competent teacher. Learning by itself is barren and also terribly hard. Without experience and insight, if either of these is missing, then the learning is likely to compound our mental distortions with a sense of arrogant superiority. This is known as spiritual pride, and it's a dangerous pitfall if we are simply acquiring more and more knowledge without putting it into practice. So that's that key. Now we can read books, we can quote stuff, we can do things, but unless there's a context, a competent lineage and practitioners, a seasoning of actually doing these things and having some insight, it's really, it can get really dangerous, actually. It can actually be a block, because we think we know stuff. There's also a danger, he's making a point, of only focusing on the practice, as if the philosophy and theory were just for scholars. They're very scholarly. It's a common thing. The Gaelic tradition that I'm trained in, very scholarly. So some other Buddhists will say, those guys are all scholars. We're meditators. And then the scholars are looking at them, what are they meditating on? They don't know anything. And meditators are going, well, you're not meditating. How do you gain anything? Everybody's pointing a finger. It's pretty funny. There's also danger. So it says, one can be a really stupid yogi, no less than a barren scholar. So you could be on either end, right? You could be a yogi who meditates all the time, but don't get much really. Don't get anywhere. And then you could be a scholar, but don't really understand anything because you haven't done the practice. So you could be on either end. You could be really book-wise or just a heavy practitioner. And I have met people who have been stuck in both. There is no rule that we must... let me just, for essence of time. Yeah, I'm going to pause there. He's just, the point I really wanted to get to was that in ourselves, we also want to be like that. I want to be able to take what I'm learning and apply it, practice it, meditate a little bit. And with that, put it in. And so if there is a context for what I'm doing, it's going to really help me. I just came from a weekend of travel and teaching different places, and as you meet people, we're very fortunate sometimes to have a lineage and teachings and a path, And there's so many out there that are just searching and, don't know what book to pick up first. And then when you go to pick up, especially in Buddhist books, sutras, there's so many. There's so many. This one guy asked me, he's reading a book. I'm not going to say it, but it's a sutra. And he's reading it, and he's just reading it dead on. And he says, man, I don't understand any of this stuff. And I go, of course not. Even this, the 7-point mind training, it's a commentary. The 7 points are just for memory. It's a way of remembering what all the teachings are. The teachings are not in the 7 points. Right, the 7 points. Practice all yogas into one. Well, that's nice to remember, but you need to know what all that means, right? So there's a commentary, there's a lineage. It's been passed down by people who practice it, and they explain it, and there's huge commentary. So, Geshe Gyaltsen, my teacher up here, he could take one verse out of a sutra, and he could spend 2 hours on that. Well, this word means this, and in that context, it means that. So here's an example. And here's 2 hours on one verse. And so sometimes we get really stuck, like this book or that sutra. And it's important to have nice commentary. So this actually is 7-point mind training text with a commentary. So I'm reading his commentary. So he's explaining the points. And then where does that fit in a path? So it's important to have that knowledge so that when we're meditating, we know why we're meditating. And then if we're meditating, maybe we can understand which meditation we're doing and why we're doing that meditation. And, sorry about that. A little achy on my knee there. The practice of the path is not, and I'm going to use a clinical term, willy-nilly. And sometimes that's the way we get stuck in it. Well, I'll go to that. This teaching kind of resonates with me. That teaching kind of resonates. Not that one. And we just start picking out things, and do this or do that. And all those can be helpful to some degree. But if we can find and connect with the path that's right for us, and there's different paths for different people. There's different teachings for different mind streams. So it's not like this is the only path. There's lots of paths for people. But when you're on that, find a teacher that has that path, has applied that path. And then we as students, we test the path. Here's a teaching, let's test it. How's that work? Let's do a little practice. Let's gain a little more understanding. Don't be stuck on one or the other. And I think that's a valuable lesson for today. Is that we want to make sure that we're balanced. That we check things. That if I hear something and it doesn't quite sound right, challenge it. Is this right? Does that add up? Doesn't add up? Challenge it. And if it makes sense, try it. Or even if it doesn't, test it out. See if it holds up. Put it into practice. So I'm actually going to pick up on that next week. All right, we'll do our dedication for the benefit of all sentient beings. So let us dedicate the merit and wisdom that we have collected here today and throughout our lives, both individually and collectively. We dedicate this for the benefit of all sentient beings. May all sentient beings be free of suffering and find lasting happiness. And may we be able to use the merit and wisdom accumulated here today and throughout our lives to purify our own minds, to cultivate a compassionate mind of awakening for the benefit of all sentient beings. Alright, well, thank you all so much for being here tonight, and thanks for joining online. May you be well, and let's practice a little bit of those practices. That's why they call them practices. All right, take care.